Hey guys, welcome to day 55 of 100 Days of Code. Today, we've got yet another jam-packed day for you because we're going to be diving deeper into web development with Flask, and along the way, we're going to be learning some new concepts as well, including how to render HTML on your websites that you serve up using Flask, and in addition, how to get hold of and parse the URL that the user typed in. Finally, we're also going to be looking into advanced decorators. So decorators where we can pass in inputs as positional and keyword arguments. And we're going to be doing some exercises around that. But what all of this knowledge is going to culminate into is a guess the number website. When we go to the home route, so just a single slash afterwards, it asks us to guess a number between 0 and 9. And then if we type in a guess into the path, let's say we decide to guess the number 3, it tells us too low, try again. So this is HTML with styling, with an H1, as well as a GIF being rendered. Now, what if we try too high? Well, we also get a GIF. And then finally, if we land onto the correct number, then we get a scene that tells us we found the correct number. So that's the goal. Once you're ready, head over to the next lesson and let's get started. Now, one of the first things I want to tackle is getting hold of what the user typed in to the URL, or rather known as parsing a URL. In this case, if the user typed in www.mysite.com and then they had a / with a path, for example, / Angela or / mail, / messages, / pictures, then we want to be able to get hold of the information in that path because we might be able to do something different with it and render something specific based on that URL. Previously, we already saw that we could change the route of our website by serving up different information. So if the user went to the home route, which is just the URL and then a /, then we would show them something. But if they went to a different route, for example, / hello, then we could show them something else. This is where we left off in our previous lessons. If I wanted to create a by function that just simply returns by, then I could set up the route decorator. So this is the decorator function to look for when the user goes to a specific path, for example, / by. Remember that this is a decorator function which lives inside a app object, which is declared in the Flask class. Now, if all of that sounded like it didn't make any sense, then be sure to review the lessons that we did in previous days on classes and methods. I'm going to assume that all of this is pretty straightforward to you by now. Now, when we run this website, we can now go to the URL and we can go to the homepage, which says hello world, and we could go to the by route, which just says by with an exclamation mark. What if we wanted to have a variable in that route? What if we want to get hold of what the user types in here? For example, let's say that instead of just catching by and /, what if we wanted to greet our user? Let's say I create a greet function that takes their name and it returns something like hello, but then it adds the name. Let's turn this into an F string to make that work. The question is, how would we create the route? Would it be / name or would it be something else? Well, this is what is described in this section of variable rules. We can add variable sections to a URL. So basically, it's the equivalent of creating a variable within that URL by marking it with this syntax. So putting some angle brackets around the variable name. Then our function is going to receive the variable name once the decorator is done with it, and then we can use it inside our function. So for example, let's say that we had a route which is / username and then forward slash the actual name of the user, which we'll put inside some angle brackets. This means that Flask is now going to turn whatever it is that comes after username forward slash into a variable for us to tap into. And that variable has the name of name. So now when our greet function goes through that decorator, it's going to receive that value and we can use it in this greet function. Now, if I go ahead and rerun my code and go back to that URL and I go to username forward slash, and then I'll put in a username, for example, Angela, then that Angela is going to be taken and it's going to be rendered dynamically into my web page. So it doesn't matter what it is I put here, it's always going to respond accordingly and treat this as if it was the value to a variable. Now, notice how every single time we update our code, so for example, if I didn't want this to be under the route forward slash username forward slash name, instead, if I just wanted to put it at forward slash name, this is not going to work as is. It's going to give us a 404, which is not found. And the reason for this is because we have to stop and refresh our server for these changes to be reflected. So I have to stop and then rerun my server. And now if I go to here and I start typing something like John, then this update to the route is now live. If we are testing and developing our website, this is really painful, having to stop and rerun the server every single time we make a change in our server file. So one of the things that you might notice here is that there is something called a debug mode, and we can set this to be on or off. Now there's a couple of advantages of having the debug mode on, and it's described in the quick start. It allows us to activate the debugger, which helps us narrow down on any issues. It activates the automatic reloader so that whenever we edit our file and hit save, it's going to reload our server. And finally, it also enables the debug mode on the Flask application. Let's give that a go. In order to change our app to run on debug mode, all we have to do is to change the debug property to true. And now if I go ahead and rerun this application, then you can see my debug mode is now on, and I've got this debugger is active and also a debugger pin, which we'll come back to in just a minute. If I go to my website, you can see that I can go to a route like this and it still works. But if I was to change something in my code, for example, just adding a new word into the return, if I go ahead and hit Command S on Mac or Control S on Windows to save this file, then it will reload the server because it's detected a change in that file and it's going to reload our server automatically so that we don't have to stop and start all over again. So now if we go back over here and we refresh this page, then you can see that update in the code is now reflected. This is pretty neat. But in addition, we could also do other things. For example, if we actually need to debug an issue. For example, let's say that here in my variable path, instead of saying name, I called it username. But then in my greet function, I'm still trying to tap into this variable called name. So now if I hit save, it's going to reload my server. And you can see that there's actually nothing wrong with what I've done. This is all syntactically valid. But if I go to my website here and I hit enter, I actually get the Flask debug view. So it's actually telling me in this nicely formatted way what is the issue. So the main issue is that I got a type error. What happens if we scroll to the bottom is that the greet function got an unexpected keyword argument called username. So that debugger might help us to figure out that, oh, actually, I've named this wrong. Now, this is an issue with the path here, but alternatively, I could have made an error in my code as well. For example, let's say that we want to take the name that's being passed in here and we decided that we were going to add 12 to it for some reason or other. Now, if I hit save so that my server reloads and I try to refresh this website, you can see again, I've got a type error. And this time though, it's telling me that I can only concatenate string, not an integer, to a string. And if we go through these files, you can see one of these lines refers to a file that we wrote, hello.py. And it tells us that on line 18 in the greet function, this is the line that's tripping it up. Now, one of the things I can do at this point is I can actually open up the Flask debugger. And I do that by clicking on this button right here. And what this is going to ask is for that pin that I showed you earlier on, which is in our console. This means that if somebody else is accessing your website live on the internet and you happen to have it in debugger mode, they can't just go and mess around with your code. Let's go and scroll to the bottom and copy our debugger code and then paste it in here as the pin and then confirm to gain access to the debugger. Now what it's done is basically it's opened up a console that is live on this line. So now what I can do is I can print out, for example, the variables that it could access on that line. For example, name, and it tells me that name is Angela. I can start diagnosing, well, why is this wrong? So if I wanted to add name to 12, well, I can narrow it down and it shows me that you can only add a string to a string or an integer to an integer. You can't mix up the types. So that might make me realize that actually I need to change this also to a string. Now if I go ahead and refresh, you can see there's no problems there and I've managed to fix the problem with the help of the Flask debugger. Now just a few more things on this URL. One of the things that we could do is we could add some text to the path before. So you remember that I said username/name, so that works. We can also add paths afterwards. So it could be 1 or 2 or whatever it may be. And we can now access this route by going to our URL and then going to the first part, which was username. And then it was the variable that we could put in. And then finally, we can add even more to the path afterwards. So in our case, the path is 1. So now if I hit enter, you can see it still goes to the same page, but it's only this middle part that's being taken as the value to this name variable. Now, if we go back to the Flask quick start, you can see that the final thing it mentions is there is something called a converter. And the converter basically converts the URL into any data type that you specify. By default, it converts that variable value into a string, which means it's going to accept any text without a slash. Now, if you want to keep the slash, because if you're using a path, then that might be quite important. So for example, you wanted to get this entire part as your variable, Angela/1. Well, then in that case, instead of using this, you would have to specify, well, the data type is going to be a path, and then I'm going to save that as the name. So now if I hit save and I use this same URL, you can see the rest of that path is now being rendered in my variable and it's being pulled in for whatever it is that I may need it for. Now, alternatively, you can also have more than one variable, of course. So maybe this first part, I'm going to keep it as a name, which is a string. And then the second part, I want a number. So maybe I'll keep it as the data type integer, and I'll give the variable a name called number. So now I can tap into the name, and then I can also tap into a number, like so. Now coming back here, if I change this URL a little bit and I hit enter, you can see it's taken this and placed it here. It's taken this and placed it here. So that's a quick little bit on how we can extract the parts that we want from a URL by using these variable paths. In the next lesson, we're going to see how we can control the HTML that gets rendered instead of just letting Flask render what is the default. So for all of that and more, I'll see you on the next lesson. Now, in the last lesson, we talked a little bit about how to get different routes to work by using the app.route decorator, as well as how we can create variable paths by using this angle bracket syntax, and how we can convert the path into a pre-specified data type by using this particular structure. Now, we also looked at how to run the app in debug mode so that we can auto reload our server and also get access to the Flask debugger. Now, in this lesson, I want to talk a little bit about how we can render actual HTML. Because at the moment, what happens is we're simply just returning a string and we're getting Flask to do whatever it wants with it. And what that means, if we go into the Chrome inspector by going to View and then Developer and then Developer Tools, is we can see it's just stuffed that whole string into a body tag without any real HTML tags that gives it structure. So that's usually not what you would want when you're creating a website. So let's see if we can start creating some HTML instead. Now, the simplest way to do this is Flask actually accepts HTML in the return. So we could just as simply say if we wanted to create an H1 by adding an H1 opening and closing tag here. And if I hit save to refresh my server and then go to my home route, then you can see this is now inside an H1 inside the body. Now, of course, you can change this to whatever tag it is you want, and it should still work. Now, once we can start rendering HTML, we can also start using the HTML attributes. By the way, if any of this that I'm talking about, HTML or CSS or attributes or tags, sounds unfamiliar, it might be because you've skipped the sessions on HTML and CSS, which we went through a few days ago. So have a quick search for that if all of this is confusing, and it might be a good time to do a revision on that anyways. Now, coming back to my H1 tag, let's say I wanted to give it some CSS, which is just inline CSS. So I'm going to set the style and give it some CSS code. For example, I could set the text align CSS property to center. And now if I hit save and I refresh on my home page, my text is now center aligned. And you can see if I select this H1, you can see that style being applied right here. Anything that we can do with inline styling that you saw in the CSS modules or changing the code to any sort of HTML tag, we can do in the return. Now, what if you wanted to render more than one HTML element? Well, that's possible as well. All you have to do is just continue typing. So let's say we wanted to create a paragraph tag. Well, we could simply create it like this. So if I hit save and refresh, you can see this is my H1 and this is a paragraph. And this is the updated structure of my HTML file. Now, because PyCharm doesn't really like you going too far over and creating very long lines of code because it's difficult to read, one of the neat tricks that it has is if you want to split a string at any point, all you have to do is hit enter and it will add in this backslash for you, which basically is the equivalent of the same code that we had before, but it's now much easier to read. So you can add in as many lines of HTML as you want in this fashion. For example, if we wanted to add another line, then we would go inside the paragraph, quotation mark, hit enter to insert another line, and here we can add our image element. Our image element is a self-closing tag, so we don't need the closing tag, but it does need a source. And this source could be an image that we find online. So let's see if we can find a picture of a kitten. This one looks pretty good. Let's go ahead and copy the image address here by right-clicking, and then let's paste that in here as the image source. Now, if I go ahead and hit save and go back to my website and reload it, you can see there is my little cat. Now, you can add other attributes to the image tag. For example, you can change the width to only 200 pixels so that it would fit in to this site a little bit better, or you can manipulate it in any way you want. Now, the great thing about the image tag is we can also add GIFs as well, and it'll be rendered in our browser. So Giphy is a great source of GIFs from all over the internet. So let's find an animated kitten on here. This one is very cute. If we go to copy link and then copy the GIF link, and we replace this URL that's currently inside the source with this new URL, then we would end up with our GIF being rendered as an image. Now, one thing to note is that as we're changing these source attributes or the style attributes, the text that's going in there is going in as a string with the quotation marks. So this will clash with any outer quotation marks. So be sure that if you've got a return as a single quoted string, that in the middle, if you need to have quotes, it will be in double quotes. Basically has to be opposite of each other. If you have single quotes on the outside, then you're going to be using double quotes on the inside. If you're using the opposite, then it's double quote on the outside, then it has to be single quote on the inside. Let's hit save and see if this worked. Go back to our home page, hit refresh, and you can see there is our very cute kitten being rendered in HTML from our Flask server. So we've now leveled up our website a little bit more. We can now render HTML, we can put in inline styling, and we can add HTML elements to our heart's content. Now, in the next lesson, I've got a little bit of a challenge for you. And the idea is for you to practice what you learned yesterday about decorators. It's a bit of an advanced topic, but once you get used to it, it's really, really handy. So for all of that and more, head over to the next lesson. All right, guys. So in yesterday's lessons, we talked about Python decorators, and we did quite a few exercises around that. Now, in order to test your knowledge and make sure that you haven't forgotten how to use it, I've got a challenge for you to apply your knowledge of decorators. Here's the challenge. In this route that I've got here, which is just /by, one of the things that we learned in the last lesson is that we can turn this into an HTML element by simply wrapping it around HTML tags. So, for example, if I wanted to turn this by into a bolded by, then I could add the B tag around it. So now if I hit save and I go to my /by route, then you can see that this text is now bolded like so. Now I can continue wrapping the text around more tags. If I want to turn it italic, then I can wrap it around some emphasis tags. So the EM tag, and this will make it look like this. And finally, I can also make it underlined by wrapping it inside a U tag, like this. So now it's bold, emphasized, and underlined, which looks like this. Now, what I want to do, though, is I don't really want to add all of this using strings because it's prone to errors and I could be making typos and it's just a bit of a pain to edit. So what I want to do instead is under the first app.route decorator, which is important to identify the route to render what's in this method, I want to be able to add some other decorators. For example, let's say I added a decorator that I created somewhere up there called make bold. And if I hit save, you can see it's done the same thing. It's added the B tag around that text. I can also add some of my other ones that I made earlier, like make emphasis and make underlined. So now I can add a whole bunch of decorators to my by function. And once that's rendered, you can see it's got the bold, it's got the emphasis, and it's got the underline. And that was much easier because I've got the auto suggest from PyCharm, and also I've got my decorator working in the background. So your task is this. Your task is to create these 3 decorators, which each will achieve the named effect. So either making the text bold, making it emphasized, or making it underlined. So this is a bit of a revision and a bit of a challenge. I'll let you pause the video and complete this challenge. And in the next lesson, I'll reveal the solution code. Give that 10 minutes, give it a good go, and see if you can complete this challenge. Previously, we looked at simple Python decorator functions. And the reason why it's simple is because all that we're doing when we're calling the function in the decorator is we're just calling it straight up. But this doesn't take into account in the cases where, for example, we want to add a condition before we call the function. Or, even more advanced, what if we needed to call the function with some sort of inputs? How would we get hold of that if it was inside a decorator? So let's say that we had a class called user. Now, if you're not familiar with classes, I strongly recommend going back to the lessons where we covered classes and objects in great detail. We did it over several days just to make sure that you're up to date with that before you continue. But this is a pretty simple class. All it does is it has two properties, a name property and an is logged in property. So basically what we're trying to simulate is a condition where, let's say we had a blog website and we had these user objects, and the user has a username and also some sort of property that keeps track of whether if the user is going onto the website and not logged in or whether if they are already logged in. So certain methods on the website can only be achieved by users who are logged in. For example, if they wanted to create a new blog post, well then that user has to be checked and we have to make sure that they are in fact logged in and authenticated to create a new blog post. If I go ahead and create a new user from the user class, then I can give it a name, which I'll put as Angela, and then I could create the blog post and pass in my user. Now when I hit run, you'll see this is Angela's new blog post being printed right here. Now, what if I wanted to create a decorator function that could be used to decorate any function on our website that requires authentication? So it requires that this user's is logged in property is set to true. So let's say that I decide to create my decorator function right here, which I'll call the is authenticated decorator. And this is of course going to need to take a function as an input, and then inside we've got our wrapper function. Now, inside our wrapper function is where we call this function that's passed in right here. And finally, to complete our decorator, we have to return the wrapper as a function without the parentheses. Now, in order to check for the is authenticated, what we actually want to do is we want to say, well, if the user dot is logged in is equal to true, well, in that case, we're going to trigger the function. But if it's actually not true, well, then we're not going to trigger the function. Now, the only problem here is that this user is undefined. We were only able to pass in the function, but what if we needed to pass in some arguments associated with that function? Notice here that our function create blog post, which is what we want to add the decorator to, accepts an input in the form of the user object. If I decorate this function with the is authenticated decorator, and I try to run this, then it's not really going to work because that user is not defined. And it tells us that the wrapper function takes 0 positional arguments, but 1 was given. And the one that's given is this user right here. This error might already be a good hint for us to figure out how to fix this. One of the things that we talked about in previous lessons is the concept of args and quags. Unlimited positional arguments normally are added in as asterisk args, and unlimited keyword arguments are usually added in as 2 asterisks and then quags. So now we can have our function, which is decorated with this decorator function. And when we call the function, we could provide some inputs. And those inputs can be tapped into via these args and quags. Now, in this case, this is a positional argument, and it's the argument at position 0. So instead of using this user, which is what we would do if we were inside this function, instead we would use the wrapper's args, and then we would use the position set to 0. So now it's going to look at the function that is going to be passed in, which is going to have some inputs, and it's going to take that first position input and then see if its is logged in property is equal to true. Now that my wrapper is taking positional arguments and keyword arguments, and I can tap into the first positional argument by using args0, well, inside the wrapped function, I can now also use this first argument in order to give it as an input to that function. Remember that this function is simply this create blog post function without the decorator. Now, if I go ahead and hit run, you'll see that nothing happens unless I change this users is logged in property to equal true. And now that that's true, then it's going to be checked right here, and then it's going to call the function because that user is now logged in. This idea of being able to pass in positional arguments as well as keyword arguments by simply adding the args and quargs to the wrapper function and then using it inside the wrapper or using it to call the function itself is one step higher in terms of understanding Python decorator functions. I recommend spending a few minutes looking at this code, which you can access at this URL, which is in the course resources, and then trying to recreate this functionality from scratch based on your understanding of what we just talked about. In the next lesson, I've got a coding exercise for you so that you can try out this new advanced form of Python decorators and try creating one yourself.